Welcome to the 10-step series of underwater photography. Right now, I'm going to talk about step 2. Be prepared with your camera setup. When I first got into underwater photography and got my first point and shoot underwater digital camera about 12, 13 years ago, I was so excited, daydreaming about all the wonderful things I'd see underwater in the ocean, the beautiful life, and just so excited about it. But I got my camera, I put it together, I assembled it, fired off a few shots, browsed through the booklet, and was not prepared. I got on the plane, didn't even really start looking at my camera and my housing and my setup till literally the night before the first dive. Well, needless to say, I made a lot of mistakes, missed a lot of good opportunities, and ended up on the whole trip with very few decent pictures. Why? Because I didn't know my camera setup before the trip. Let me show you a few examples. All right, I would see a subject, I'd see something that looked interesting, and then I'd either scare it away while I'm fiddling around, moving stuff around, looking at my housing, trying to change the levers and the gears to find out what my aperture should be, is my strobe on, etc. Or I would take so much time that the subject would just lose interest and say, well, I'm going to find another photographer and swim away. So here's some of my pictures early on in my career. Fishtail. All right. Here's another one. Nice macro shot of a scorpion fish. I'm spending time looking how I'm going to crop and compose this picture. Forgot to turn my strobe on. Fired a few shots, strobe didn't go off, the fish swam away. So much for that picture. I didn't understand something called shutter leg. That's when there's a little bit of delay from when you depress the shutter and the shutter actually releases. So a lot of my pictures that I thought I had composed and framed relatively well came out like this. I had a wide-angle wet lens. That's a lens that underwater you attach to your housing, and it allows you to shoot wide-angle with a point and shoot. I was very excited about it. I put it on the boat, but once you get underwater, you're supposed to take it off and put it back on to let some water in between the outer part of your housing and in between the wide-angle lens. Well, I put it on the boat, on dry in the air, and then I forgot to take it off and put it back in the water, and I took a lot of pictures, and they all came out blurred because I had air in between my housing and the external wet lens, the wide-angle lens. There's so many things to keep in mind when you're diving. You've got to look at your equipment, your gauges, your navigation, your dive buddy. You know, how much air do you have left? On top of that, then you have to deal with your camera and your camera housing. Then you have to find a subject, approach it, and take pictures. So if you're not really familiar with your camera and housing, that skill set, believe me, is going to be the first one that you lose. So it's so important to know your camera and your camera housing thoroughly before the dive trip. I would recommend practicing topside. Take a lot of pictures. Be very familiar how to quickly switch, turn your strobe on and off. Are you going to shoot auto or manual or aperture priority? Learn how to change the ISO setting, the shutter speed, the aperture. Learn all that to use your housing so it comes second nature. Overlearn it. Then it'll be easy to do underwater, and you're less likely to forget it, and you'll be less likely to succumb to task overload. All right? Another thing. Here's an example of a point and shoot setup. My daughter with my old CNC camera there and a couple strobes, and here's my wife holding the Nikon D300 with the SLR and a dome port and a couple of strobes. So there's a lot of equipment we have to deal with underwater photography. One other thing I'd like to say, do not rush the morning of the dive putting your camera setup together. That is so important. In fact, I'd recommend having a checklist of all the equipment to bring, to pack, so you don't forget a crucial piece of equipment, and also a checklist that you go over every morning or the night before the dive, ideally, of how you're going to set up the camera, the O-ring. Take the lens cap off. Do you have the memory card? Is the strobe charged? Things like this. You can download these checklists from my website, by the way. Anyway, mistakes that I have made myself because I'm rushing on the morning of the dive. I'm too busy. I want to have breakfast with my dive buddies. I'm worried about the dive conditions. I'm worried about my sinuses. I've got enough things to deal with, packing all my dive equipment. It's nice to have the camera packed and ready to go the night before. These are mistakes that I have made. I went without my strobe charged, okay? Had the whole dive trip, no strobes. I went with a memory card, but guess what? The memory card was full, no images. I had a 2-tank morning dive trip. The entire time I had my ISO setting set at a really high level, so all the pictures came out noisy and grainy, just ruined. I had one time, actually 2 times, 2 different times where I didn't have an O-ring in my strobe and flooded my Ike-Lite strobe and ruined them 2 different times. And once, believe it or not, I'm not proud of this, I decided at the last minute to run into the water and do some early snorkeling in the Caymans. I didn't close the latches on my houses, flooded my Nikon D300. Very bad. So, in conclusion, know your camera setup cold. Practice topside with your housing so you know all the controls. If possible, practice in a pool or in a lake before the dive trip. Make checklists of what equipment to pack and how to set up the equipment the day before the dive. And do not rush getting your camera set up on the day of the dive. All right, this concludes step 2. We're now going to go on to step 3, understanding the water column. Thank you very much.